There's an interesting story in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9. I would encourage you to turn there with me this morning. Mark's Gospel, chapter 9. And it's the story itself is interesting, not because of the events themselves, but because of a conversation that Jesus has with a man who has a son who has been struggling with a demon. And the demon causes this child to act like today what we would call an epileptic, have massive seizures and throws himself on the ground and so forth. And the disciples of Jesus are arguing with the scribes that have come against them. Jesus is away, and the disciples of Jesus, not the inner circle of disciples, but the larger group of disciples, are arguing with the scribes about casting out this demon and so forth, and they've apparently been trying to do so and unsuccessfully. And so Jesus appears on the scene, and he asks the man, the father of this child, how long has this been happening? Verse 21. And the man says to him, from childhood, and it is often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Notice those words. If you can help, if there's anything you can do, if there's anything at all that you can do, would you have compassion and help us? And Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes. There's some question as to exactly how to read that sentence. Some would suggest it's, if you can, and then there's others who would say, if you can, all things are possible. It's hard to understand exactly how the Greek goes, but either way, what Jesus is saying to him is, all things are possible for the one who believes. And the father of the child then cries out at that statement and says, I believe, help my unbelief. That's a fascinating statement, isn't it? Does he believe or not? I believe. Help my unbelief. I bring the story up because there's a reality that we need to talk about following from last week's sermon on the concept of assurance. The concept of assurance, as I said last week, is this idea that we can and should know that we are indeed saved and in a state of grace before God. We can know that, and we should know that. And the basis, the foundation of this assurance that we have, of course, is Christ Jesus. This assurance that we have is something that exists within us, looking outward from ourselves to the work of Christ, the person of Christ and the work of Christ, looking out from ourselves to Him. But, and here's the but, and this is the but that probably most of you immediately penciled in after last week's sermon. But I live in the real world, preacher. I live in a world in which there is doubt and struggle with assurance. Thank you for helping me to know where to go, but that is a problem for me. We live in a fallen world. We live in a world in which there is sin and doubt and struggle. And so while it is true that we can and should have assurance, the reality on the ground is that not all of us experience it on a regular basis. The confession writers understood this when they wrote about assurance. They were men who recognized reality and the reality around them. And so in the fourth paragraph, third and fourth paragraph of this section on assurance, they write of this. And here's what they say. This is starting in the third paragraph. This infallible assurance doth not so belong to the essence of faith, but that a true believer may wait long and conflict with many difficulties before he be a partaker of it. It's not an instantaneous thing, in other words. There's work that will have to be done for this assurance to come. Yet, being enabled by the Spirit to know the things which are freely given him of God, he may, without extraordinary revelation, meaning in the normal course of life, in the right use of means, attain thereunto. He might find assurance through the normal course of things in this world. And therefore, it is the duty of everyone to give all diligence to make his calling and election sure. And then it goes on in chapter 4 to say, true believers may have the assurance of their salvation, diverse, or Old English for diverse ways shaken, diminish, and intermittent as by, ... We can and should, as I said, have an assurance of being in a state of grace. But there will be times when our assurance, now this is strictly from a human point of view, when our assurance is shaken, when our assurance is diminished, when our assurance is intermittent, comes and goes, if you will. There will be times when our assurance, which should be present in us, will be shaken. A shaking of our assurance that will occur through circumstances, things that come along and seem to cast doubt about our true sense of being in a state of grace. A little bit of shaking of our lives will happen at times. There will be also a sense of diminishment, a reduced sense of truly knowing that we are in a state of grace, believing yet struggling with unbelief, like the man in the story. I believe, but help my unbelief. And then, of course, it'll be intermittent when there will be times when we're unsure of our status before God. A temporary suspense of true assurance that we remain in a state of grace. What the confession writers will do here, then, is give 4 specific times when we will find our assurance to diminish or to be shaken or to be intermittent. What I like about this particular paragraph is that it's extremely honest. Okay? These are men who were not super spiritual, super saints who lived perfect lives. No, they were ordinary men like you and I, struggling with sin, struggling with doubt, struggling with a world of persecution and opposition and trouble and all kinds of things. And they said, let us write for you a list that will help you, because knowledge is power. Knowing that these times will come, that you can be prepared for them. So there are 4 specific diminishments of our assurance that will come. And one of them, the first of them that they write of, is a diminishment due to negligence. Negligence. You see, we are called, actually we are instructed, according to 2 Peter 1:10, to make our calling and election sure. Now that's a fascinating statement, isn't it? How in the world do we make our election sure? I mean, after all, isn't that not something God does? If election is what God has chosen to do before the foundations of the world by virtue of his radical choice of grace to embrace a people, a specific people that he knows by name, that he creates purposely, how in the world can we assure that if it's something that God has done? And the answer isn't that we are not attempting to actually create the election, but we are simply to assure that we belong to it. Now, I realize that there are some who would say, well, you can never really know whether you're elect or not. And the confession writers would say, el wrongo. Okay? Now, they probably wouldn't say exactly that. They were English, all right? But they would say that is wrong. No, we can know whether we are members of the elect. And how do we know that? We know that by what we see. And we can know that, the confession writers say, through the ordinary means of grace. The ordinary means of grace. To practice in greater measure those attitudes that are common to the heart of flesh. Now let's talk about these ordinary means of grace. Ordinary. Not extraordinary, not spectacular, not supernatural, not special, ordinary stuff. God has provided for us a whole bank of ordinary things that He's given to us that, by the way, we take for granted, and that's part of our problem. They're ordinary so that they're available from His mercy and grace for us to use as a part of the determination that we do belong. Those things established, and get this phrase now, in the church, for the maturity of the believer and the growth of these attitudes from him or her. I haven't told you the attitudes yet. I'll get there in a second. Ordinary things. Preaching is an ordinary means of grace. Sitting where you are and listening to somebody preach to you the Word of God is an ordinary means of grace. It's not an extraordinary thing. It's an ordinary thing. That's why ordinary guys like me do it. It's an ordinary means. It's something that God has given to say, this is what I put before you to help you. Teaching. God has raised up men to teach the Word. He's raised up women to teach for the purpose of growing up the people of God. Is this not very prominent in Ephesians 4, which we looked at some time ago, remember? The ordinances, baptism and the Lord's Supper, are designed to be ordinary means to remind us again and to be visible to us of what it is that God has done and what He is doing in us. The fellowship that we have together, good old-fashioned koinonia fellowship that we have, is an ordinary means. As we come together, iron sharpening iron, strengthening one another, holding one another up, it's the ordinary thing. It's an ordinary thing for us to come together and be held accountable, etc. These are the ordinary means of grace. And what Peter will tell us in 2 Peter 1:10 is he will tell us that through these ordinary means of grace, through these common things, we will grow up in these attitudes that will permeate our lives. It begins with faith, and it moves to virtue, and it moves to knowledge, and it moves to self-control and steadfastness or discipline, godliness, brotherly affection, and love. These are the things that will lead him to say, now that is what the ordinary means of grace should produce in us. The pursuit of these things, then, is what shows evidence that we are in fact elect. It is the pursuit of these things that shows the evidence that we are in fact a part of the number who is in fact elect. The question of who is elect and who's not elect is not hard to determine. The answer is those who pursue these things are elect. Those who do not are not. Very simple. God creates a people that He knows by name by filling them with a desire to pursue these things. He doesn't give that to those who are not chosen. Those who do not belong to His elect have no desire for any of these things. They don't desire virtue. They don't desire knowledge, meaning the knowledge of God and His ways. They don't have any compunction about self-control. I mean, the world in which we live ought to scream that message, right? Self-control, what is that? Steadfastness, discipline, godliness, true brotherly affection and love are the things that characterize those who belong to this election. And the pursuit of these things is what demonstrates that we belong to this election. So when we say make your call in election sure, what Peter is actually saying is pursue these things. Chase these things. The unregenerate man cannot pursue these things. He has no heart to do so. The regenerate man must practice these things because his heart compels him to do so. And so what the confession writers will say here, building upon what Peter says in his own words, is a negligence in the pursuit of these attitudes may lead to a diminished sense of assurance. When our lives are not filled up with the ordinary means of grace that God has provided for us in the pursuit of these things, we may step back and say, I really wonder if I belong. I really wonder if I'm saved. You see the connection? God has given to us an ordinary set of things that we are to do. We are to join together unto preaching and teaching. We're to be fellowshipping with one another. And as we do those things, the goal will be that we'll be pursuing godliness, that we'll be pursuing holiness, self-control, brotherly affections. Those things will flow out of us. But when we step back from those ordinary means of grace, when we decide, you know what, I don't really need to be a part of the church on a regular basis. You know, I could be here once every 6 weeks, and that's about enough. Guess what's going to happen? We're going to find ourselves in situations out there in the real world where we're going to say, I just wonder if I really belong to this God at all. What the confession writers are saying is, listen, a negligence of what God has given to us to help us pursue our calling and our election surety, if not pursued, will lead to diminishment of assurance. What's interesting is that this confession writers actually quote from Song of Solomon here. They actually quote from the book of Song of Solomon. I'd have you, if you can find it in your Bible. You don't go there very often, right? So it's like, I don't know where it is. It's page 676. If you're using the exact same Bible I have. Song of Solomon, chapter 5. You know, I had to spend a bunch of time trying to figure these verses out, I will confess. I'm thinking, what in the world does this have to do with assurance? Okay, chapter 5, Song of Solomon, chapter 5, starting at verse 2. Okay, there's a header over the top of this in the ESV. Maybe it is in yours. It's she. All right, so this is the woman speaking. Remember, this is a man and a woman who are pursuing one another. Okay, so here's the woman's side. All right, she says this. She says, I slept, but my heart was awake. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, she's dreaming, right? Or she's considering, okay? A sound, my beloved is knocking. And then she quotes him, speaking now. Open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my perfect one. For my head is wet with dew, my locks with the drops of night. Okay, so the picture is a woman who is having a dream about her lover coming to her. This is a man who loves her dramatically, okay? And he's come to knock on her door, and she's asleep, right? And so he comes, and he is filled with a passion to see her. Verse 3. I had put off my garment. How could I put it on? I had bathed my feet. How could I soil them? My beloved put his hand to the latch, and my heart was thrilled within me. Okay, now notice verse 3. She's lying there in the bed, the door, someone's knocking at the door, right? Someone that she wants to see is there, but what is she doing? If I get up, I got to put my robe on, and then I got to find some slippers because I've washed my feet. She's making excuses for not wanting to get up, right? You see it? She knows that her lover's at the door. She wants to see him. She's excited that he's there, but at the same time, she's like, that's a lot of work to get out of bed and go to open the door and to see him, okay? Now, look at verse 5. I arose to open to my beloved, and my hands dripped with myrrh, my fingers with liquid myrrh on the handles of the bolt. I got up. I was excited. I really wanted to see him now, okay? But notice verse 6. I opened to my beloved, but my beloved had turned and gone. Okay. Here's what this is, okay? There's an allegory being painted here. In fact, much of the book of Song of Solomon can be pictured as an allegory between the Son, who is the Christ, and his people, the church. Okay, I think that's one massive interpretation of this book. All right. There's an allegory here of the beloved being Christ and the bride being the believer. So this is the believer sitting in the bed, and Christ has come to the door. So the beloved comes to the bride in verse 2, in this case, in a dream, sort of as a general calling, but the bride resists getting up to greet her beloved because she has put off her garment and she has bathed her feet. She makes excuses. for not going to him. She neglects his advances. You see it? So when the bride does not get up to go to the beloved, he turns and he goes. Her excuses have caused him to leave, assuming that she's not interested in him. He's knocking at the door. She's inside making excuses. When she finally does get up, he's already gone. And the picture that's being painted here, and the reason why the confession writers chose it, is because it's the picture of this negligence. This idea of us not pursuing the things that Christ has given to us. If we do not use them, it becomes natural that we might begin to doubt whether we belong to him. If we neglect to pursue what the Spirit has given to the church, it stands to reason that we will feel a sense of doubt about our eternal condition. The reason that God says, gather together with the saints, the reason why the Spirit draws people out of the world into the church, is because he knows that that is the means by which he's going to bring them to a state of full assurance that they belong to this Christ. You see this? Preachers harp upon you coming to church all the time, right? But why? Is it because we need your smiling faces in the audience? Or is it because we know that God, in his infinite wisdom, has designed the church and the fellowship of believers to be a strengthening of our understanding of this Christ and a greater and greater assurance we belong to him? Because when we walk away from the church, we have no such assurance. And listen, every single Barna or Pew poll I've ever read confirms this. Those who walk away from the regular and consistent fellowship around the table, around the church, around the preaching, fall away from the faith. Their assurance falls off. I don't know. So the one place where we will struggle with our assurance is in negligence, when we simply do not pursue that which gives us assurance. But there's three more. The second of them is the most obvious one. And the most obvious one is when we sin. When we choose to purposely sin. Now, in this case, the confession writers call it special sin. Now, they don't mean special in the sense of a fun sin. They mean a grievous form of sin that we purposely pursue after because we want it, all right? For another way of saying this to me would be the besetting sin that sits within all of us, okay? Now, what I have you do is on the back of your sermon folder, I want you to write down what that besetting sin is exactly. Sign your name to it and pass it to the edges. We'll be collecting those. I'll go first. No. A particular and special kind of sin, a specific sin that we are pursuing after. Now, again, not the typical sins of everyday life that are common to the human experience, all right? We're not talking here about the everyday living of the human experience. We're all struggle with various kinds of things that come along. You know, every once in a while we lose our temper. You know, we spat out a word that's inappropriate. We act lustfully. The list goes on and on of things that just come at us day after day after day, moment after moment. We're not talking about that, okay? We're talking about a specific kind of sin, a special kind of sin. Now, let me just pause here and remind you that the true Christian recognizes that perfection in this life is impossible. Okay, so we're not talking about here having some sort of perfection of living in such a way that you know that you never have diminishment. That's what we're talking about. Paul speaks of this great war in Romans 7 that's going on between the flesh and the mind. The mind which says, I want to do the things of God, I know what I ought to do, and the flesh which seems to go in the other direction all the time. He knows of this. He understands this, particularly as we grow up in our sanctification, particularly as we pursue after those things. We find that war raging even stronger in us. In fact, it is in the face of such normal sin that assurance is truly seen. What we're talking about here is a specific sin, the confession writer says, woundeth the conscience. A special sin that is unusual, great, and grievous, abnormal in the life of the believer because we know it grieves the Spirit. It stands out, if you will, amongst all of the other sins of our life. Again, if we're truly honest with ourselves, all right, many of us, unfortunately, have an innate ability to shove that besetting sin into a corner and ignore it. But as the Spirit of God works on us, He's going to drag that out of the closet, okay? This particular specific sin is something that's abnormal in our life because we know that it grieves the Spirit. It is a sin that pushes back against the progress made by the Spirit in our sanctification. And how many of us, now don't raise your hand, but how many of us can really feel the tension here? That sense of, yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. There's a particular area, a particular thing about me that I struggle with. In fact, it's very much why I believe that when Paul speaks of the thorn that he had in the flesh, he's talking about a temptation that he struggled against. Not some physical ailment. I know that's the common definition of that. I don't agree with that at all. I think that Paul struggled with a specific besetting sin. I would even argue I know what it is. Pride. That Paul had a sense, I can believe at any given moment that I'm better than all the other apostles, that I'm greater than any other Christian that's ever come along. Makes sense, doesn't it, considering that he was? The fact is that we all have that in ourselves. We all have that in our reality. A great and purposeful sin will lead to a diminished sense of assurance. Now, you should all at this point in unison say, duh. Because yes, would not it be reasonable to assume that if there's that particular moment in which we grieve the Spirit and we know we have, what's our first reaction supposed to be? What should our first reaction be? I wonder if I really am a Christian. I continue to do that all the time. I mean, look, a good Christian, a real Christian, a truly saved person wouldn't be doing that every day. Wouldn't be struggling with that particular thing, right? You ever asked that question? The confession at this particular point references probably the greatest psalm of repentance ever written, Psalm chapter 51. In Psalm 51, of course, after David has his tremendous sin with Bathsheba, and probably the greater sin of killing her husband, he writes such words as in verse 8, "Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have broken rejoice." What is he saying? You, O God, have broken my bones for what I've done here. What I've done here now clearly sets me aside from you, O God. Let them rejoice again. Verse 12, "Restore to me the joy of your salvation." What is he saying? Have I lost that salvation? Do I belong anymore? I mean, what I've done, I deserve to be cast out, do I not? Restore that joy of salvation to me and uphold me with a willing spirit. How about verse 14? "Deliver me from blood guiltness, O God of my salvation." Blood guiltness. In other words, a long word basically meaning I deserve to suffer the punishment imposed upon humanity in the Noahic covenant for taking the life of another man. I deserve to die. I don't deserve salvation. I don't deserve your good graces. I deserve to die. Here's a man who knows the sin that he committed, and now what is he experiencing? The question, am I really saved? Do I really belong to this God? Do I really get to enjoy the fruits of salvation upon me, or is it something else? You see, if we sin, if we purposely sin, if we go after and pursue a particular special kind of sin, it is reasonable for us to feel the shame and to lose a true sense of being saved. It makes sense that we would, right? In those moments of sin, we should step back and ask ourselves, do we really belong to this Christ? And I would argue that if you've never felt that, you may not have ever really been saved to begin with. Because that would be the heart cry of the one who grieves the Spirit. So one way that we find ourselves often feeling a sense of unassurance, is that a word? Is when we neglect the good things that God has given to us. And secondly, when we purposely sin. But there's a third, and this takes us down another path similar to the previous one, and that is a diminishment of our conviction here based on temptation that comes to us. Now notice the distinction I'm making here with my second point, and that is not a diminishment due to the actual committing of sin, purposing and doing something, but rather a period of time or a special circumstance in which we find ourselves tempted to sin. Or let me rewrite what I think the confessors were trying to say. A period of unrelenting attack in which we feel the deep pressure to do wrong, to do evil. A time of temptation. Not actual sin, but temptation. And then we wonder, in the midst of these times when we are being attacked, if these temptations are evidences that we're not truly saved. If there are evidences in us, well, would the truly saved person be struggling with this particular thing? I mean, would God allow the actual born-again person to want to do these things? Would He allow that in the life of the believer? Now, let me remind you of something that you should already know, of course, but that temptation itself is not sinful. Because if it was, then Jesus was a sinner. Because He was tempted. Matthew chapter 4, we see the devil come to Him and tempt Him in three very specific and concrete ways designed to overthrow His position as Messiah. And we're told then in Hebrews chapter 4 that He was one who was like us, tempted in every way, yet was without sin. Tempted like us in every way. So every kind of temptation that we have experienced, not every specific temptation, but every kind of temptation, He experienced as well. Listen, He went through puberty too, you know. And He experienced the temptations that come along with being a teenager. I know there's some people who hate that when I say that. But it must be true. Because we've all experienced that same kind of temptation, right? He's been tempted in every way that we have, yet He was without sin. He did not act upon those temptations, and it did not mar Him simply because He was tempted to them. But if we go through a period of unusual or strong temptation to sin, we may feel ourselves like, I don't really know whether I belong to this God or not. I mean, how could a true follower of Christ want to do that? And some of you may have more experience than others with these kinds of things, where this kind of temptation seems to permeate your life. I'm sure some of you could tell war stories in here about the kinds of things that you're constantly being lured to, that you have to push back against constantly. I know in our day it's now become vogue for the church to say, you don't have to push back against those things. Just be what God made you to be. But the true follower of Christ says, no. No, I must resist the temptations that naturally flow out of my nature to follow after this Christ, as He did. I can assure you this, by the way, and I think I can state this categorically without anybody here disagreeing with me, and that is that Jesus probably experienced more temptation and a more difficult temptation than any of us would ever imagine. I don't think Matthew 4 was the only time the devil was following him around. If the Garden of Gethsemane doesn't send a message about the temptations of Jesus, I don't know what does. The psalm writer here writes, in the confessors, I should say, speak from Psalm 31 on this regard. In Psalm 31, we have a song of deliverance in a moment of feeling overwhelmed by the plots of others. This is the same psalm that has that great quote of Jesus, "Father, into your hand I commit my spirit." But what you see in this is a sense in which you have go down to verse 21. I'll read it, you'll get it. "Blessed be the Lord, for he has wondrously shown his steadfast love to me when I was in a besieged city." What's a besieged city? In ancient times, to attack a city that was armored against attack, it had walls, sometimes even double walls, and various kinds of methodologies of protecting itself. You would simply, as an enemy force, lay siege to the city. What you would do is surround it with an armed force and just wait it out. Because eventually the people inside are going to run out of food, they're going to run out of water, they're going to run out of ammunition and whatever else they've got to fend you off, and you're just going to be able to march on in. That's what David is feeling. It's as though I was living in a besieged city. As though I'm living in a city that has protections, but I know that eventually my guard's going to fall. There's an army surrounding me, an army of evil. It's the picture of an army of temptation surrounding us, the constant sense in which we're pushing back against what we know we ought not to do, and yet our bodies say, do it, do it, do it, do it. And in verse 22, he says, "I had said in my alarm," or in my haste, "I'm cut off from your sight." What's the reaction that he has? I'm surrounded by the temptation, and my reaction is to say, God must have abandoned me. I'm trapped in this world of temptation, which must mean that God's not interested in me. See it? There's going to be times when we face those dark hours of temptation where we struggle against the constant onslaught, and we're going to assume a distance between us and God. During periods of great spiritual trial, it is reasonable to feel a sense of distance from God and question the veracity of our salvation. Are we really saved? Would God really save a wretch like me who's constantly under attack by evil? Because all those preachers out there have told me that once I come to Jesus, all that's gone. See, all those preachers simply tell me, walk the aisle, pray the prayer, and guess what? Ta-da! Magic happens, and your life is going to be filled with wonderful fairy dust. No. So, when you neglect the things that God gives you, you will feel a sense of diminishment of assurance. When you fall into special sin, you certainly will. When you're surrounded by a time of temptation, you will as well. But the confessors also mention one more, and that is during a period of darkness. During a period, what I would call little revelation. Darkness, of course, is the opposite of light. Darkness is the lack of light, right? So darkness is that situation in which we do not have the light. And when we think about light in the Bible, of course, we think about revelation. We think about God's knowledge being made known to us. So when we talk about a period of darkness, then, we're talking about a period of time when God is distant to us. He feels distant. Have you ever had people say that to you? He feels far away from me, right? And this distance is either by our own voluntary choice, which is often true, especially if the first one of my points is valid, right? When we neglect the ordinary means of God, we have a sense of feeling far away. But it's also, and this is important, it can also be during times when God has ordained for us to go through a period of darkness. Does God only ordain for us to go through happiness and joy and success and wonderfulness in our lives? Well, if you believe the prosperity preachers of our day, the answer is yes. But they couldn't be more wrong. In fact, they're dangerously wrong when they say that, because they lie. Remember, the devil comes as an angel of light. He twists the truth slightly, right, to make it look good to us, so that we sheep who are stupid, we fall into it, right? The truth is that God has, in fact, ordained for all of us to go through periods of darkness. Why? Well, the answer is obvious, of course. To test us, to grow us, to break our sense of apathy, to break us of our sense of, I don't care. To remind us of the goodness of walking close to Him, to feel the weight of what Christ has experienced for us, or just as a set of circumstances in a fallen world through which He accomplishes a purpose in or through us. The diagnosis, as awful as it is, can be used by God for great good. All depends on how we look at it, right? Our natural tendency, of course, as human beings is to assume that that kind of a diagnosis is the worst thing we can hear. But those with a Christian worldview would step back from it and go, wait. Yes, it's awful. But what if God intends to do something fabulous with this? What if God intends to take this diagnosis, which means my time on this earth is coming to an end, but He's going to do something fantastic with it in the life of someone else? We go through the periods of darkness. We go through periods where there is no light. We go through times when darkness pervades our existence and there seems to be no word from God for comfort. We search the Scriptures diligently looking for an answer to the question, and we come away empty because we don't think there's revelation there. But there is. The natural inclination, however, of that particular time in our lives, for many, unfortunately, is not to pursue after what it is that God would be doing with it, but rather for us to step back and go, well, God must have abandoned me. I'm going through this period of time, this period of darkness, this awful situation that no one else in the world could possibly understand. That was sarcasm. I'm the only one that's ever experienced this, so it must mean that God doesn't love me anymore. It's a period of distance from God, and it may lead to a diminished sense of assurance. Now, you'll notice that in all four of these, the natural inclination of each experience or each circumstance is to lead us to a conclusion, and the conclusion being that we no longer belong to this God. What are the confessors saying? They're saying, let's be honest. Here's the honesty. You are going to experience these kinds of things in your life, and your natural temptation will be to then assume something over the top of it. And the assumption over the top of it is that you are not, in fact, any longer in the good graces of God, that you're no longer saved. When you walk away and you start neglecting the good means of grace that God has given you, you might walk away thinking, I don't belong to the Lord anymore anyways. Or when you commit some special sin, you might say, see, a good Christian wouldn't do that kind of thing. Or when you have these moments of great temptation and you're struggling against the flesh and the lust of the flesh, you might say, well, this must mean that God doesn't love me anymore. or when God purposes to withdraw his face from your life for a while, or to set in motion circumstances that seem to obliterate you, your natural temptation might be to say, maybe God just doesn't love me anymore. Now, I think if you're honest, as these men were, as I said at the beginning, you've probably experienced this. If you've lived for any amount of time, you've probably experienced this, right? Those moments in which you wonder. I do. I look at my own besetting sin in my life, and I know exactly when I do it. I know exactly when and how. And the natural question that comes with the guilt and shame that follows it is, I wonder if I really am a believer. Or have I got all these people fooled into thinking that I am? Have I got myself fooled into thinking that I am? The natural temptation, if you will, is to say, I wonder. I wonder if this is really true. But let me answer this, because right about now I'm going to need to be passing out the antidepressants, right? No. The fact is this might be real, but it doesn't have to be the case. Because we'll go back to what I said last week. Our assurance is in knowing that Christ paid perfectly for our sin. Where does it start? It starts in knowing something. Knowing something that sits above all of these situations. I know that this Christ went to a cross to pay for sin. I've seen it. I've trusted in it. And therefore, we can confidently stand before God with an absolute assurance of our state of grace. Now, you might be saying, you are really contradicting yourself here, pal. Right? Logic class 101, right? On the one hand, you say, we can have these moments in which we're diminished of assurance, and then turn around and say, but we can have confidence in the midst of those. And the answer is, yeah, we can. Let me show you how in all four of the previous points. When we are negligent, when we have been negligent, when we know that we have walked away from the ordinary means of grace for a period of time, as is, of course, a great temptation to sin. I would argue all of these are, in fact, temptation to sin. But in these moments of negligence, what do we need to do? How do we solve this? And the answer is, we look to the cross, and we see the faithfulness of Christ on that cross. We unfaithful, him faithful. So what do we have to do? We have to say, wait a minute, Lord, I know, I admit it, I repent. I have failed to take advantage of the ordinary means of grace that you have given to me. I've repented of that by looking to the cross and seeing the faithfulness of this Christ. My assurance is not found in what I'm about to do, in other words. In this moment of neglect, we say, well, Lord, I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to be the most faithful church member anybody's ever seen. In fact, I'm going to give 12% instead of 10. Watch this. See this? This is what's going to happen here. That's not assurance. Because 2 weeks later, you're going, Lord, can we make this best 2 out of 3? No, the fact is that we cannot look to what we're about to do. Rather, we look away from ourselves. What do we look to? We look to the faithfulness of Christ. In the whole area of special sin, right? What do we need to do? In the midst of that shame and that guilt, as even as David himself did, right? Create in me a pure heart, O God. What does he do? I'm going to look away from me to you. And specifically, I'm going to look to the cross, and I'm going to see what it is that Christ accomplished on it to pay for this sin. I'm going to trust what you promised, O God, when you said that all who will look upon this Christ and call his name will be saved. So I'm going to do that. I'm not going to promise you that I'm never going to commit this sin again. Oh, I will make that promise, yes. I will repent, and I will try very hard next time, but you know, Lord, that I'm going to fall into this again. We're not going to find assurance by making bargains with God, because they never work, right? The guy in the plane going down, I promise you, God, that if I can survive this, I'll do this and that for you. And you get out of the plane and go, just kidding. That's what we do. When we have purposely sinned against this God, what do we got to do? We got to turn away and look to him. In those moments where we are being tempted, in that phase of life where there's this constant barrage to the lust of the flesh or the lust of the eyes or whatever it is that God has let you to be, what do we need to do? We look away from ourselves and we look to the one who was tempted as we are but never failed. You know, God, I'm struggling with this life of temptation. I know what I'm supposed to do, and it is a constant battle, and for now I'm being successful, but I feel far from you. But I can see your Son and his faithfulness. I can know your Son was faithful, and I will follow after him. He was tempted. He never failed. I'm tempted, I will fail once in a while. But I look away from myself to him. And nowhere is it more obvious than in this time when we feel abandoned. And the fact of the matter is that most of the time when we feel abandoned, it's our own doing, not his. Because even in the examples that I gave, in these moments of darkness, in these diagnoses of tragedy, we can know that there's something good that can happen from it. In the midst of these moments where we feel abandoned, we need to, again, look away from ourselves, and we look to the one who sits at the right hand of the Father and advocates for us. We have an advocate. We often forget that, don't we? We often forget that we have one who is seated at the right hand of his Father, making intercession for us night and day, who is constantly reminding his Father, this one is mine. This one is mine. Don't abandon him. He is mine. We feel abandoned when in fact we're not, because we have an intercessor, an advocate for us before the Father. Now let me remind you again of what I said last week, and this is where this matters to us. Assurance, the true assurance of our salvation in the midst of all of these situations, which all of us will nod our heads and say, yeah, that's me, pal. Our assurance in all of this is a theological matter, not a practical one. It's not a matter of trying to figure it out and make it happen. It's not a matter of trying to say, well, I'm going to find assurance by doing this and being faithful at this and being faithful at this, because we're never going to do it. We're never going to be successful at it. I would hope that we would be improving, but we're never going to be fully successful in this life at it. It's a theological matter. We find our assurance looking outward, never inward, outward, looking to this Christ. Here's how the writers of the confession put the end of this paragraph. Listen carefully to what they said. They write these things. These 4 periods of time are when we're going to struggle. Yet, okay, that's a big word, right? In our modern English, we'd say, but are they never destitute of the seed of God and the life of faith? That love of Christ and the brethren, that sincerity of heart and conscience of duty, out of which by the operation of the Spirit, this assurance in due time be revived. And by the which, in the meantime, they are preserved from utter despair. Listen. In each of those situations where we struggle with assurance, do we really belong to this God? Are we really saved? Do we really know him? The Spirit of God knows his own, and he holds them fast. They will never escape. From our perspective, we may look at life and say, I don't know. But the Spirit of God says, I do. I know who are mine. I know what they're going through. Yes, they may have grieved me by their sin, but I will not let them go. All that the Father gives me will come to me, and I will lose none. They are mine. Jesus goes to the cross and says, I'm going to pay for a sinner who's going to all their life bounce around with, am I saved or am I not saved? Do I really know? I've got these struggles. I've got these difficulties. And this Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father and says, this one is mine. You have given him to me. Speaking to the Father, I will not lose one. I've sent my Spirit to hold them fast to me. You and I must therefore remember this simple reality. Making our calling and election sure is about being watchful for those things that may threaten to undo our surety. Now that you know 4 specific areas of your life that you might experience a lack of assurance in, right? Be watchful for those things now. Be looking for them. When those doubts creep in and you say, wait, the preacher said this was going to be the time. And what did he say? He said, we look away from ourselves, we look to this Christ, we keep our eyes fixed upon him, and we will find assurance in the midst of this situation. Knowledge is power. What? We know. Notice how foolish it is for the preachers of our day to simply say, look, you come to Jesus, everything's going to be great. It's going to be wonderful. Because they go out into a world and struggle with all 4 of these areas. And what's the answer that's given to them? As I said last week, the question never quite hits the mark. Well, you mustn't have enough faith then. Or maybe you need to get baptized again. Or you need to commit your life to Jesus again. And again, and again, and again. In some sort of public display of religiosity. That's not what Scripture says. What Scripture says is, look to this Christ. Just look to this Christ. See what he has done. And know that he is your advocate and your redeemer. And you will find that assurance again. The Spirit of God will bring it to you. Sounds so very simple, doesn't it? And yet it is a complex reality in our lives. But this Spirit, he will not give up. The Spirit of God, oh no, he's been set by Jesus himself to you as you know him, and he is going to hold you fast to himself.